You've just killed a nobleman. The guild said it was clean, silent, fast. But now the bells are ringing. The guards are searching every inn. And you're bleeding. The city gates are locked. The bounty's on your head. This is the life of a medieval assassin. No mercy, no backup, no mistakes. Now tell me, where are you watching this from? And what time is it? I go through every comment. You'd be surprised how many of us are here at the same time. And subscribe if you're coming back for more. You think being a medieval assassin was glamorous? Think again. While Hollywood shows you sleek figures in black robes sliding effortlessly through shadows, the reality was far more brutal, disgusting, and downright miserable than any movie dares to show. The year is 1347, and you're crouched in a narrow alley in Florence, Italy. The cobblestones beneath your knees are slick with something you don't want to identify. Could be horse urine, human waste, or the rotting juice from yesterday's market scraps. Your stomach churns not from nerves, but from the rancid piece of bread you choked down this morning. It's been 3 days since you've had a proper meal, and the copper taste of hunger coats your tongue like metal shavings. Your target is Marco Benedetti, a wealthy silk merchant who's been skimming profits from his guild. Someone wants him dead, and they're paying you enough silver to eat for a month. But here's what the stories never tell you. Medieval assassination wasn't about honor or political intrigue. It was about survival, desperation, and the kind of grinding poverty that makes you willing to do anything for your next meal. The stench hits you first, a cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, and open sewers that makes your eyes water. Florence in the 14th century wasn't the Renaissance paradise you see in paintings. It was a maze of narrow, filthy streets where chamber pots emptied from second-story windows without warning. You've learned to hug the walls and keep your mouth shut when walking underneath buildings, unless you enjoy the taste of strangers' waste. Your weapon isn't some elegant curved blade forged by master smiths. It's a rusty kitchen knife you stole from a tavern 3 weeks ago, its handle wrapped in strips of cloth to hide the bloodstains that won't wash out. The metal is pitted and dull, which means you'll have to get close, really close, and hope you can find the right spot between his ribs before he starts screaming. But here's the twist that would make your blood run cold. You're not even a real assassin. You're just another starving peasant who got desperate enough to accept a contract from people whose names you don't know, for reasons you'll never understand. The romantic notion of trained killers belonging to ancient organizations? Pure fantasy. Most medieval assassins were simply criminals, desperate souls, or soldiers between wars who needed coin and weren't squeamish about how they earned it. The reality cuts deeper than any blade. You have no training, no backup plan, and no guarantee you'll survive the next hour. Marco Benedetti emerges from his house like a peacock preening in silk and velvet, completely unaware that death is watching him from 30 feet away. His clothes cost more than you'll see in 5 years, assuming you live that long. The irony tastes bitter in your mouth. You're about to kill a man whose single ring could feed your family through winter, yet you'll never see more than a handful of silver coins for the deed. Your hands shake, but not from fear. It's the constant tremor of malnutrition, the body's protest against months of near starvation. Every assassin in medieval times battled this same enemy, their own failing body. Strong food was for the wealthy. You subsisted on watery porridge, moldy bread, and whatever scraps you could beg, steal, or scavenge. The morning sun slants through the narrow gap between buildings, creating a golden slice of light that would seem beautiful if you weren't planning murder. Dust motes dance in the air like tiny spirits, and for a moment you wonder if they're the souls of other desperate people who stood in similar alleys, clutching similar weapons, making similar choices. You force yourself to move, each step bringing you closer to a point of no return. The leather soles of your boots, if you can call them boots anymore. They're mostly holes held together by prayer, make soft squelching sounds against the wet stones. Medieval streets were perpetually damp from a combination of rain, waste, and the general dampness that comes from poor drainage and too many bodies packed into too small a space. But here's what really made medieval assassination a nightmare profession. There was no such thing as a clean getaway. No sewers to disappear into, no rooftops designed for parkour escapes. Medieval cities were contained, enclosed spaces where everyone knew everyone else's business. Kill someone important, and within hours every gate guard, every merchant, every beggar on every corner would know your face. The weight of this reality settles on your shoulders like a lead cloak as Marco draws closer, his soft leather shoes clicking against stone with the confidence of a man who's never had to worry about where his next meal would come from. You grip your pathetic weapon tighter, knowing that in the next few minutes, both your lives will change forever, assuming either of you survives what comes next. The question that haunts every medieval killer echoes in your mind. Is silver worth your soul when you're probably going to die anyway? Marco's boots click closer, each footstep hammering against your skull like a blacksmith's anvil. You press yourself deeper into the shadows, feeling the rough stone scrape against your back through the threadbare fabric of what used to be a shirt. The merchant moves with the lazy confidence of someone who's never been truly afraid, never gone to bed hungry, never woken up wondering if today might be his last. Your breathing sounds impossibly loud in your own ears, but you know it's just panic playing tricks. Medieval cities were never quiet. There was always the rumble of cart wheels, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of horseshoes on stone, and the general din of thousands of people crammed into spaces designed for hundreds. The noise should cover your approach, but your heart pounds so hard you're convinced everyone within a mile can hear it. The knife feels wrong in your grip, too light and too heavy at the same time. You've killed before a chicken here, a pig there, but never a person. Animals die differently than humans. They don't beg. They don't have families who'll weep over their corpses. They don't look you in the eyes and ask why. But here's the brutal truth that separates medieval assassins from modern fantasies. Most of them were already dead inside long before they picked up their first weapon. Starvation does something to your mind, strips away the parts that care about right and wrong until only survival remains. You stopped feeling guilty about stealing bread months ago. Killing a man for coin is just the next logical step down a path you never chose to walk. Marco pauses to examine something in a shop window, and you notice how his hand rests casually on a small purse at his belt. Inside that leather pouch is probably enough coin to transform your entire existence. Real food, clean clothes, maybe even a roof that doesn't leak when it rains. The distance between you and him might as well be the gap between heaven and earth. Medieval wealth wasn't just about having more things. It was about inhabiting a completely different reality. While you count copper coins and dream of meat, Marco probably throws away more food in a day than you see in a week. His silk doublet has never known the stench of unwashed bodies or the itch of lice. His soft hands have never scraped against stone or bled from hard labor. The morning light shifts, and suddenly you can see your reflection in a puddle at your feet. The face staring back looks like a stranger hollow cheeks, wild eyes, skin stretched tight over bones that show too clearly. This is what desperation looks like when it wears human features. This is what the fairy tales never mention when they spin stories about noble killers and righteous vengeance. You realize with cold clarity that you're not just hunting Marco Benedetti. You're being hunted too by poverty, by circumstances, by choices that were never really choices at all. The real enemy isn't the silk merchant counting his coins. It's the world that created a system where his death seems like your only path to survival. But here's the twist that makes your blood freeze. You're not the only one watching Marco today. Across the narrow street, Partially hidden behind a wooden cart loaded with turnips, another figure lurks in the shadows. Someone else has had the same idea, accepted the same contract, or simply decided that a wealthy merchant makes an attractive target. Competition in the assassination business was fierce and usually fatal. There were no territories, no honor among thieves, no professional courtesy. If two desperate killers targeted the same mark, only one would walk away with the payment, if either survived at all. Your rival is better fed than you, which means better equipped, probably faster, and definitely more dangerous. His leather jerkin looks intact. His boots appear waterproof, and most terrifyingly, he's not shaking. Either he's done this before, or he's simply reached a level of desperation that surpasses even yours. The medieval world was full of these mirrors. People just like you, facing identical choices, driven by the same grinding needs. Poverty bred killers the way stagnant water bred plague rats. Every alley contained someone willing to spill blood for bread. Every tavern housed men who'd murder for a warm bed. Marco seems oblivious to the death closing in from two directions. He continues his leisurely examination of the merchant's wares, probably deciding between different shades of silk thread, as if such choices matter when your life hangs in the balance. The casual way he handles items worth more than most people's annual income makes your jaw clench so hard your teeth ache. You have perhaps 30 seconds before the other assassin makes his move, which means you need to decide right now. Attack first and hope for the best, or wait and see if your competition succeeds so you can potentially steal his reward. Both options could end with your death, but medieval life rarely offered comfortable choices. The weapon in your hand suddenly feels heavier, more real, as the moment of truth approaches. Everything you've ever been taught about right and wrong wars against the simple, animal need to survive another day in a world that seems designed to kill people like you. Time slows to a crawl as 3 lives converge in a few square feet of dirty cobblestone, and you finally understand why nobody writes songs about the glory of being a medieval assassin. Your competitor moves first, stepping out from behind the turnip cart with surprising grace for someone who probably hasn't bathed in weeks. The morning light catches the edge of his blade, a proper dagger, not your pathetic kitchen knife, and you realize you're about to witness your own death played out by someone else's hand. The irony cuts deeper than steel. You came here to kill, and instead you'll watch another desperate soul do what you couldn't bring yourself to finish. But Marco Benedetti isn't the helpless merchant you assumed. The moment he spots movement in his peripheral vision, his hand drops to his own weapon, a short sword that's clearly seen use. Rich doesn't always mean soft, and successful merchants in medieval Florence didn't stay successful by being easy targets. His blade clears its sheath with the smooth whisper of well-maintained steel. The sound freezes your blood because you recognize it instantly. It's the sound of expensive craftsmanship, of metal that's been properly cared for, sharpened by professionals, and wielded by someone who knows how to use it. Your competition has just challenged a man who might actually be more dangerous than both of you combined. The dance that follows happens in heartbeats but feels like hours. Your rival lunges forward with desperation-driven speed, his dagger seeking the gap between Marco's ribs. But the merchant sidesteps with practiced ease, his sword arcing upward in a perfect defensive cut that opens the attacker's throat like a second mouth. Blood sprays across the cobblestones in a crimson arc that catches the morning light like scattered rubies. The assassin, your competition, your mirror, your cautionary tale, drops to his knees with a wet gurgling sound that will haunt your dreams for years to come. His dagger clatters against stone, useless now, while his life pumps out through his fingers in thick, dark streams. This is what medieval death actually looks like. Messy, brutal, and surprisingly quick. Marco Benedetti stands over the dying man, breathing hard but uninjured, his sword still gleaming with fresh blood. He's not the soft merchant you imagined. He's a survivor who's probably faced situations like this before, who carries his wealth because he's strong enough to defend it, smart enough to recognize threats, and ruthless enough to end them permanently. You remain frozen in your hiding spot, watching this scene unfold with the sick fascination of someone witnessing their own alternate future. That could be you bleeding out on the stones, your life spilling away for the sake of a few silver coins you'll never live to spend. The reality crashes over you like ice water. You're not a predator stalking prey. You're prey pretending to be a predator, and the difference just saved your life. But here's the twist that makes your hands shake even more violently. Marco's eyes sweep the alley and lock directly onto your hiding place. He knows you're there. He's known all along. The successful merchant who survived an assassination attempt isn't going to leave loose ends wandering around to try again later. Come out. His voice carries the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them. You have no choice. The kitchen knife drops from your nerveless fingers as you emerge from the shadows, feeling like a child caught stealing from the pantry. The dead assassin's blood is already starting to congeal on the cobblestones, creating a sticky mess that makes each step sound like peeling wet leather. Marco studies you with the calculating gaze of a man who's made his fortune reading people correctly. His sword remains ready but not threatening, which somehow makes him more terrifying than your rival ever was. This is what competence looks like. Calm, controlled, absolutely lethal when necessary. You're not much of an assassin, he observes, and you realize there's almost sympathy in his tone. Too thin, too scared, wrong weapon, worse technique. Someone paid you to kill me, didn't they? You nod because lying seems pointless when you're standing 3 feet from a man who just killed someone with professional efficiency. The admission feels like swallowing broken glass. But what's the alternative? He already knows why you're here. Who hired you? The question is asked in the same tone he might use to inquire about the weather, but you can hear the steel underneath. This man didn't become wealthy by accepting half answers or comfortable lies. The problem is, you don't actually know. Medieval assassination contracts were usually arranged through intermediaries, tavern keepers, fence operators, or street children who carried messages for copper coins. You met with a hooded figure in a dark corner, received half payment up front, and were told the rest would come after the job was finished. Names were dangerous luxuries that smart criminals avoided. I don't know, you admit, and watch his expression shift slightly. It's not disbelief, it's recognition. He understands how these arrangements work, which means he's probably been involved in similar transactions from the other side. Marco Benedetti sheathes his sword with the fluid motion of long practice, then reaches into his purse and pulls out a small leather pouch. The coins inside jingle softly as he tosses it at your feet, where it lands with a wet sound on the blood-stained stones. That's more than whoever hired you was going to pay, he says quietly. Take it and disappear. Find different work. Because if I see you again, or if anyone else comes for me, I'll assume you broke our agreement. You stare at the pouch, understanding that this is probably the strangest job interview of your life. A man you came to murder is offering you more money than you've ever seen at once, in exchange for not murdering him. The medieval world was full of these bizarre inversions of expectation. But as you reach for the coins, one final realization hits you like a physical blow. Marco Benedetti isn't just sparing your life out of mercy. He's buying your loyalty, creating a debt that transforms you from potential enemy to reluctant ally. Every successful merchant understands that sometimes it's cheaper to purchase someone's cooperation than to kill them and deal with the consequences. The pouch feels impossibly heavy in your hands, weighted with more than silver. It carries the promise of full bellies, clean clothes, and a chance to choose a different path. But it also carries the knowledge that you'll always be connected to this moment, to this man, to this choice that isn't really a choice at all. Welcome to medieval life, where even mercy comes with strings attached. The weight of Marco's silver burns through the leather pouch and into your palm, but the real weight is the understanding that your life just took a turn you never saw coming. You're no longer a failed assassin. You're something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. You're a bought man, owned by someone who understands exactly how to turn enemies into assets. Walking away from that blood-stained alley, you realize the medieval world operates on rules that would make modern people's heads spin. Honor, loyalty, friendship, these weren't noble concepts born from virtue. They were survival mechanisms, business transactions dressed up in prettier language. Marco didn't spare you from kindness. He invested in you like he'd invest in a new trade route or a promising apprentice. The silver in your pouch jingles with each step, a constant reminder that you now owe a debt that can't be measured in coins. In medieval Florence, debts like this followed people to their graves and sometimes beyond, binding families across generations. Your children, if you live long enough to have any, might find themselves answering for choices you made in a moment of desperation. But here's what truly separates medieval life from the sanitized versions you see in stories. Everyone carried these invisible chains. The baker owed the miller, who owed the Lord, who owed the church, who owed the Pope, who owed God. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social, spiritual, and political all at once. Your obligation to Marco Benedetti just made you part of a vast web of mutual dependency that held society together through sheer necessity. You stop at a tavern 3 streets away, partly to celebrate your unexpected windfall, but mostly because your legs won't carry you any further. The rush of adrenaline that kept you moving is fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that makes even standing feel like climbing mountains. This is what surviving your own death feels like, a peculiar mixture of relief and terror that settles into your bones like winter cold. The tavern keeper's eyes widen when you produce actual silver to pay for your ale and bread. Clean money is rare in places like this, where most transactions involve copper pennies worn smooth from handling or goods traded directly for other goods. Your sudden wealth marks you as either very lucky or very dangerous, and in medieval society, both conditions attracted the wrong kind of attention. As you tear into the first decent bread you've tasted in months, another truth settles into your consciousness. You have no idea how to be anything other than desperate. Poverty wasn't just about lacking money, it was a complete worldview, a set of survival skills that suddenly seemed useless now that survival was temporarily assured. What does someone like you do with enough silver to last half a year? The answer, unfortunately, is that most people in your situation find creative ways to lose it quickly. Medieval society didn't offer investment opportunities for former assassins. You couldn't open a savings account or buy stocks in the silk trade. Your options were essentially to spend it all on immediate pleasures or hide it somewhere and hope nobody found your stash while you figured out what came next. But spending it felt wrong somehow, like cheating fate or insulting the dead man whose blood was probably still staining your boots. Your unnamed competitor had died for these same coins, bled out on cobblestones for the chance you now held in your hands. Using his sacrifice to buy ale and whores seemed like the kind of cosmic injustice that medieval people believed would bring divine retribution. The irony twisted deeper the more you thought about it. You'd set out to become a killer and instead discovered you were too squeamish for the work. Your rival had possessed the necessary ruthlessness but lacked the skill to survive his first real target. Marco had both qualities in abundance, which explained why he was wearing silk while you'd been wearing desperation like a second skin. Medieval life was full of these harsh lessons about the difference between wanting something and being suited for it. The streets were littered with failed knights, incompetent merchants, hopeless artists, and would-be assassins who discovered too late that ambition without ability was just another form of suicide. As the afternoon wore on and the tavern filled with the usual collection of merchants, laborious, and petty criminals, you started to notice how they looked at you. Word traveled fast in medieval cities, faster than horses or official messengers. By evening, half of Florence would know that someone had tried to kill Marco Benedetti and failed spectacularly. By tomorrow, they'd know that a second assassin had been present and somehow walked away richer. This kind of reputation was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple recognition. It marked you as someone who'd been tested and found wanting, which was almost worse than never being tested at all. Failed assassins occupied a peculiar social position, too dangerous to trust, too incompetent to fear, too compromised to employ for legitimate work. The realization hit you like a physical blow. Marco's silver wasn't a gift or even a bribe. It was a golden cage, trapping you in a life where you'd always be slightly outside normal society, forever marked by this moment when you chose survival over violence. You'd never be a respectable merchant or craftsman because people would always remember what you almost became. But perhaps that was fitting. Medieval society didn't believe in redemption through good intentions or personal growth. You were what your actions made you, and your actions had made you something new, not quite criminal, not quite innocent, definitely not respectable. You existed in the gray spaces between categories, which was exactly where most people actually lived when you stripped away their pretenses and public faces. The tavern candles flickered as evening deepened into night, casting dancing shadows that reminded you uncomfortably of this morning's alley. Soon you'd have to decide where to sleep, what to do tomorrow, how to build some kind of life from the wreckage of your failed assassination career. The silver in your pouch had bought you time, but time was just another kind of debt, one that would eventually come due with interest, whether you were ready to pay or not. This was the final lesson of medieval life. Every choice created new problems, every solution demanded new sacrifices, and every ending was really just another beginning in disguise. You finished your ale and stepped back into the Florence night, carrying Marco Benedetti's silver and the weight of understanding what it really meant to be alive in a world that specialized in turning people into things they never intended to become. The story of why it sucked to be a medieval assassin wasn't really about assassination at all. It was about being human in an inhuman time, when survival required compromises that would haunt your dreams for whatever remained of your brutally ordinary life. The weeks that followed taught you lessons about medieval life that no amount of desperation could have prepared you for. With Marco's silver, you could afford a proper room in a respectable inn, but the other guests treated you like a plague carrier. They sensed something different about you, the way you flinched at sudden movements, how your eyes constantly tracked exits, the unconscious habit of keeping your back to walls. Word of your involvement in the failed assassination had spread through Florence's criminal underground like wildfire through dry thatch. You discovered that being a known failure was worse than being unknown entirely. The desperate criminals who might have hired you for future work saw you as unlucky. The legitimate merchants who might have offered honest employment saw you as dangerous. You'd found yourself trapped in the worst possible position, notorious enough to be unemployable, but not feared enough to command respect. The silver that had seemed like salvation slowly revealed itself as another form of prison. You couldn't spend it freely without drawing attention to your sudden wealth. You couldn't save it safely because medieval banking was reserved for people far above your social station. Every transaction reminded shopkeepers and innkeepers that you possessed money without any visible means of earning it, which raised uncomfortable questions about where it came from. But the real education began when you tried to leave Florence entirely, hoping to start fresh in another city where your reputation hadn't preceded you. Medieval travel wasn't just difficult. It was a complex web of permissions, tolls, and bureaucratic barriers designed to keep people exactly where they belonged in the social order. A former peasant carrying silver attracted suspicion from every gate guard, customs official, and local authority between Florence and anywhere else. Your first attempt to reach Venice ended at a checkpoint 20 miles from the city, where armed guards demanded documentation you didn't possess, explanations you couldn't give, and bribes you couldn't afford to pay repeatedly. The silver that had made you wealthy in Florence's slums made you a target on the roads, where bandits and corrupt officials viewed unexplained prosperity as an invitation to redistribute your wealth more equitably. Returning to Florence felt like admitting defeat, but the alternatives were starvation, highway robbery, or worse. Medieval life offered very little middle ground between established social positions. You were either a peasant bound to land, a craftsman bound to guild, a merchant bound to trade routes, or an outlaw bound to nothing except the probability of violent death. Your brief flirtation with assassination had knocked you out of every legitimate category without providing entry to any sustainable alternative. The irony that had defined your entire experience deepened with time. Marco Banadetti's mercy had saved your life but ruined your future prospects. You were alive but unemployable, wealthy but trapped, free but bound by reputation and circumstance. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval existence, the way good fortune often created new forms of misery that were impossible to anticipate or avoid. Winter arrived early that year, bringing the kind of cold that penetrated stone walls and settled into human bones like permanent residents. Your silver had dwindled through months of overpriced rooms and carefully rationed meals, leaving you facing the same desperate poverty that had driven you to assassination in the first place. The cycle was completing itself with mathematical precision, returning you to circumstances that would eventually demand choices you'd hoped never to face again. But something had changed during those months of uncomfortable limbo. You'd learned to read people differently, to recognize the signs of desperation in others that you'd once worn so obviously yourself. The skills that had made you a terrible assassin, observation, patience, understanding of human motivation, turned out to be valuable for entirely different purposes. Medieval Florence was full of people carrying secrets they couldn't afford to have discovered. Merchants hiding debts from creditors, wives concealing affairs from husbands, craftsmen selling inferior goods as premium quality, priests breaking vows they'd sworn to keep. Information about these secrets had value, and people would pay to keep certain knowledge from spreading to the wrong ears. You'd accidentally stumbled into the profession that would define the rest of your life: blackmail. Not the crude, violent extortion practiced by common thugs, but the subtle, sophisticated manipulation of information that medieval society's complexity made both possible and profitable. Your failure as an assassin had taught you something more valuable than killing techniques. It had shown you how to threaten people without violence, how to leverage fear without bloodshed. The realization arrived like sunrise after the longest night of your life. You didn't need to kill Marco Banadetti to profit from knowing his secrets. You just needed to know which secrets other people would pay to learn, and which ones they'd pay even more to keep hidden. Medieval society ran on reputation and appearance. Destroying someone's standing was often more effective than destroying their physical body. Your new career began with small transactions, confirming a merchant's suspicions about his partner's honesty, providing a wife with evidence of her husband's gambling debts, helping a guild master understand why certain apprentices always seemed to know about surprise inspections. The work paid less than assassination would have, but it was considerably safer and infinitely more sustainable. The greatest irony of all? Marco Banadetti became your first regular client. The man you tried to kill discovered that someone with your particular combination of desperation, street knowledge, and moral flexibility could be extremely useful for legitimate business purposes. He needed information about competitors, insights into criminal activities that might affect his trade routes, and occasionally assistance with problems that required unofficial solutions. Your failed assassination had evolved into successful employment, proving that medieval life specialized in transforming disasters into opportunities for those clever enough to recognize the possibilities hidden within their own failures. The silver he'd given you that bloody morning had been an investment after all, not in your loyalty, but in your potential usefulness as a professional observer of human weakness. Years later, you would understand that this story had never really been about assassination at all. It was about the medieval truth that everyone was always one bad decision away from desperate circumstances, and one stroke of luck away from discovering that their worst qualities might actually be their most valuable assets. In a world where survival required constant adaptation, failure was just another form of education. Expensive, painful, but ultimately practical for those wise enough to learn its lessons. The man who'd once hidden in alleys clutching a rusty knife eventually died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by the accumulated secrets of half of Florence's most respectable citizens. He never killed anyone, never became the assassin he'd briefly imagined himself to be. Instead, he became something far more dangerous and infinitely more successful. Someone who understood that in medieval society, knowledge was the sharpest weapon of all, and the truth was always worth more than silver to people desperate enough to pay any price to keep it buried. That was why it sucked to be a medieval assassin, because the real money was in letting people live with their secrets, not dying for the chance to keep them. But the deeper truth about medieval assassination only became clear as your new profession flourished and you began to understand the vast networks of violence, debt, and desperation that connected every level of society. The failed assassin you'd watched die in that Florence alley wasn't an anomaly. He was the visible tip of an invisible iceberg that stretched through every guild, every household, every sacred institution that claimed to represent order and civilization. Medieval assassination sucked not because it was difficult or dangerous, though it was certainly both. It sucked because it was unnecessary. The entire profession existed to solve problems that medieval society created through its own brutal design. People hired assassins to eliminate business rivals because legitimate competition was strangled by guild monopolies. Wives paid killers to murder abusive husbands because divorce was impossible and domestic violence was considered a private matter. Lords commissioned deaths of rebellious peasants because the legal system was designed to protect property rights rather than human dignity. Every contract you investigated, every whispered conversation you overheard, every desperate soul who sought your services revealed the same underlying pattern. Assassination was medieval society's pressure valve, a crude method of resolving conflicts that proper institutions should have handled peacefully. The profession thrived precisely because civilization had failed to provide civilized alternatives to its most basic problems. Your years in the information trade brought you into contact with others who'd followed similar paths. Former soldiers turned mercenaries, defrocked priests become forgers, failed merchants transformed into smugglers. Each had their own version of your story: initial desperation, a moment of violent possibility, then adaptation into something more sustainable and ultimately more profitable than their original intentions. Medieval life was full of these transformation narratives, but they rarely resembled the heroic journeys celebrated in songs and stories. Real change came through compromise, accommodation, and the gradual recognition that survival required abandoning idealistic notions about honor, justice, and moral purity. The world didn't reward virtue, it rewarded usefulness, and usefulness often meant becoming complicit in systems you'd once found repugnant. The most successful people you encountered had learned this lesson early and embraced it completely. Marco Benedetti hadn't become wealthy by being more virtuous than his competitors. He'd succeeded by being more ruthless, more willing to use violence when necessary, more adept at manipulating the social and economic systems that governed medieval commerce. His mercy toward you hadn't been kindness. It had been calculated investment in a resource that might prove valuable later. This was perhaps the most depressing aspect of medieval assassination as a profession. It was entirely rational. In a world where legal remedies were expensive, slow, and often ineffective, Hiring someone to kill your problems made perfect economic sense. The moral considerations that might have deterred modern people were luxuries that medieval society couldn't afford to indulge. Your own moral evolution mirrored this broader social reality. The man who'd once hesitated to kill Marco Benedetti gradually became comfortable orchestrating the destruction of reputations, the manipulation of marriages, the careful devastation of business partnerships through strategic revelation of damaging information. You told yourself these activities were less harmful than murder, which was technically true but missed the larger point. You'd become a different kind of assassin, one who killed trust instead of people, who destroyed lives without spilling blood. The final irony revealed itself slowly, over years of careful observation and painful self-reflection. Medieval assassination sucked not because it was evil. Evil was a luxury concept for people secure enough to make moral distinctions. It sucked because it was boring. The dramatic confrontations, elaborate plots, and personal vendettas you'd imagined were fantasies invented by people who'd never actually lived in the medieval world. Real assassination was mostly waiting, sitting in taverns listening for useful information, following merchants through their daily routines, building relationships with servants and apprentices who had access to their master's secrets. The actual violence, when it occurred, was brief, clumsy, and usually performed by people too desperate or too drunk to care about technique or honor. You'd spent your entire adult life in a profession that existed to solve medieval society's problems through the most direct possible means, only to discover that the problems themselves were more interesting than their solutions. The web of debt, obligation, fear, and mutual dependence that held civilization together was far more complex and ultimately more powerful than any individual act of violence could ever be. As old age approached, you found yourself wondering what would have happened if you'd succeeded in killing Marco Benedetti that morning in Florence. Someone else would have taken his place in the silk trade. His debts would have passed to his heirs. His business relationships would have been absorbed by competitors. The systems that had made his death seem valuable to someone would have continued operating exactly as before, generating new conflicts that would require new solutions. Medieval assassination was ultimately a distraction from the real mechanisms of power and change in medieval society. It focused attention on dramatic individual actions while ignoring the boring institutional processes that actually determined how people lived and died. You'd spent decades helping people believe that their problems could be solved through targeted violence or strategic information, when the truth was that their problems were built into the very fabric of the world they inhabited. The man who'd once crouched in a Florence alley clutching a rusty kitchen knife died understanding something that would have saved him years of moral compromise if he'd grasped it earlier. Medieval life sucked for everyone, not just the assassins. The profession existed because the world was badly designed, and all the killing in the world couldn't fix fundamental problems that required fundamental solutions. That was the final lesson of why it sucked to be a medieval assassin, not because the work was difficult or dangerous or morally compromising, but because it was ultimately pointless. You could spend your entire life becoming very good at something that didn't actually matter, serving systems that didn't deserve to be served, solving problems that would immediately regenerate themselves like severed Hydra heads. Medieval assassination was a perfect metaphor for medieval existence itself. Brutal, necessary, completely rational, and utterly futile. The real tragedy wasn't that people died violently, but that they lived desperately, in a world designed to ensure that desperation would always create new generations of people willing to kill for coins they'd never live long enough to spend on anything that mattered. And that, ultimately, was why the stories never told the truth about medieval assassins. Because the truth was too depressing for anyone to bear, too systemic for heroes to fix, and too boring for songs. Reality was just people trying to survive in impossible circumstances, making terrible choices that solved nothing while creating new problems that would require new terrible choices from the next generation of desperate souls. The darkness of medieval life wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. That was the most soul-crushing realization of all. The legacy of your medieval life extended far beyond your own experience, rippling through generations in ways that illuminated just how thoroughly the assassination profession had infected every level of society. Your children, when they finally came, grew up knowing their father's reputation without ever understanding the full scope of what that meant for their own possibilities in life. Medieval social mobility was already limited under the best circumstances, But being the child of a known information broker and former failed assassin created unique challenges that normal people never had to navigate. Your eldest son showed promise as a scholar, but the church refused his application to seminary school because of your reputation. Your daughter possessed natural talent for weaving, but the textile guilds wouldn't accept her as an apprentice because guild membership required family respectability that you could never provide. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval existence, sins passed down through bloodlines like inherited diseases, affecting people who had never made the choices that created their disadvantages. Your attempt to escape poverty through violence had succeeded in lifting you from desperation, but it had also ensured that your descendants would face obstacles that might have been avoidable if you'd chosen starvation instead of assassination that morning in Florence. The irony deepened as you watched your children adapt to circumstances they'd never chosen. Your son became a merchant's clerk, using the observation skills he'd inherited from you to excel at detecting fraud and manipulation in commercial transactions. Your daughter married into a family of dyers, where her understanding of secrets and hidden motivations made her invaluable for navigating the complex social dynamics that determine success in guild-dominated industries. They'd inherited your talents along with your reputation, discovering that the qualities that had made you unsuitable for respectable work were exactly the abilities they needed to thrive in their own chosen fields. Medieval society might have been brutal and unfair, but it was also pragmatic. Useful skills eventually found applications, regardless of their morally questionable origins. Your grandchildren grew up with even stranger inheritances. They knew their grandfather had once been involved in something disreputable, but the specific details had been softened by time and selective family storytelling. To them, you were simply the old man who could predict people's behavior with uncanny accuracy, who always seemed to know when merchants were lying about their prices or when neighbors were planning to cause trouble. The assassination profession that had defined your adult life gradually faded into family legend, transformed from brutal reality into cautionary tale. Your descendants learned to navigate medieval society's complexities with skills that had originated in desperation, but evolved into sophisticated understanding of human nature and social dynamics. But the broader implications of your story extended beyond your immediate family. Medieval Florence was full of people carrying similar legacies: children and grandchildren of failed knights, unsuccessful merchants, desperate criminals who'd made choices that haunted subsequent generations. The city's social fabric was woven from these threads of compromise, adaptation, and inherited consequence. This was the final truth about why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. The profession never really ended. It transformed, evolved, and perpetuated itself through families and communities in ways that ensured medieval society would always contain the seeds of its own violence. Every generation produced new desperate people who would consider assassination as a solution to problems that proper institutions should have been able to address through peaceful means. Your death, when it finally came, was as mundane as most medieval deaths. A fever that arrived with winter weather and refused to leave despite the best efforts of local physicians whose medical knowledge was centuries away from understanding infection or proper sanitation. You died in the same bed where you'd spent your final years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried your legacy forward into a world that remained fundamentally unchanged despite all your efforts to carve out a better place within it. The funeral was small but well attended, filled with people whose lives you'd touched through decades of information brokerage and quiet manipulation of circumstances that might otherwise have destroyed them. Former clients, current associates, and even a few competitors came to pay their respects to someone who'd understood medieval society's unspoken rules better than most and had used that understanding to help others navigate systems designed to crush people like them. Marco Benedetti, now an elderly man himself, spoke briefly about your professional relationship, carefully avoiding any mention of the circumstances under which you'd first met. To the assembled mourners, you were simply someone who'd been useful to important people, which was perhaps the highest praise available in medieval society for someone of your background and reputation. But the truest eulogy came from your eldest granddaughter, who'd inherited your ability to see through social pretenses to the desperate motivations that actually drove human behavior. She understood what the others couldn't articulate: that you'd spent your life serving systems that didn't deserve to be served because survival required accommodation with injustice, and that your compromises had created possibilities for future generations that wouldn't have existed if you'd chosen moral purity over pragmatic adaptation. The story of why it sucked to be a medieval assassin ended not with dramatic revelation or heroic transformation, but with the quiet understanding that every choice creates consequences that extend far beyond the person making the decision. Your failed attempt at assassination had set in motion decades of adaptation, compromise, and gradual improvement that ultimately benefited people you'd never meet, in ways you could never have anticipated. Medieval life was like that, brutal in its immediate demands but surprisingly generous in its long-term possibilities for those clever enough to transform their worst qualities into useful skills. The world that had nearly destroyed you had ultimately been changed by your presence in it, not because you'd been particularly heroic or virtuous, but because you'd been stubborn enough to survive and adaptable enough to find value in experiences that most people would have considered purely destructive. That was the final lesson, whispered in the winter wind that scattered the last remnants of your funeral procession. Medieval assassination sucked because it was unnecessary, but the people who survived the attempt to become assassins often discovered skills and perspectives that medieval society desperately needed, even if it could never openly acknowledge that need. Your life had been a testament to the strange alchemy by which medieval civilization transformed its most destructive impulses into creative forces, ensuring that even failed assassins could eventually become integral parts of the world they'd once tried to violently reshape. The darkness of medieval existence was real, but it was never complete. There were always small lights of adaptation, understanding, and inherited wisdom that made the brutality bearable and the future possible. In the end, you'd learned why it sucked to be a medieval assassin not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of years, relationships, and small compromises that had gradually revealed the true nature of the world you'd tried to murder your way out of. The final irony was that understanding that world completely had been far more valuable than escaping it could ever have been. Looking back across the centuries from our modern perspective, the true horror of medieval assassination becomes clear through the lens of systematic analysis rather than individual tragedy. What made the profession unbearable wasn't the violence itself, but the way medieval society had structured itself to make violence seem like the only rational solution to problems that could have been solved through better institutions, fairer laws, and more equitable distribution of resources. The archives of medieval Florence, preserved in monasteries and guild halls throughout Italy, contain thousands of documents that reference assassination contracts, mysterious deaths, and unexplained disappearances that follow patterns remarkably similar to your own story. These records reveal that failed assassins were actually more common than successful ones, and that most people who entered the profession did so not from any natural inclination toward violence, but from circumstances that had eliminated all other viable options for survival. Church records from the period show a dramatic increase in confessions related to planned but unexecuted murders, suggesting that medieval society produced far more potential assassins than actual killers. The moral weight of contemplating murder was apparently heavier than the practical difficulties of carrying it out, which explains why so many attempts failed and why the profession attracted people who were fundamentally unsuited for its demands. Economic historians have traced the correlation between harvest failures, plague outbreaks, and spikes in assassination contracts, demonstrating that the profession served as a crude form of social safety net for people who had exhausted all legitimate means of securing basic necessities. When agricultural productivity declined or trade routes were disrupted, desperate people turned to violence not because they were naturally criminal, but because medieval society provided no other mechanisms for surviving economic catastrophe. The most telling evidence comes from contemporary letters and diary entries written by merchants, clergy, and government officials who lived through the period. These documents reveal that everyone understood the connection between social conditions and professional violence, but no one felt empowered to address the underlying causes. Medieval leadership was trapped in systems that perpetuated the very problems that assassination was supposed to solve. Legal records from across Europe show that successful prosecutions of assassins were extremely rare, not because the crimes were difficult to detect, but because conviction would have required acknowledging that the social order itself was fundamentally flawed. Judges, prosecutors, and government officials all benefited from systems that channeled social frustration into individual acts of violence rather than collective demands for institutional reform. The strangest aspect of medieval assassination, revealed through careful analysis of surviving contracts and correspondence, was how rarely it actually worked as intended. Killing individual people almost never solved the underlying problems that had motivated the contracts. Business rivals were replaced by their associates, abusive husbands were succeeded by equally problematic relatives, corrupt officials were followed by equally corrupt successors. This ineffectiveness wasn't accidental, it was structural. Medieval society had organized itself in ways that ensured individual problems were symptoms of systemic issues that couldn't be addressed through targeted violence. The profession persisted not because it was effective, but because it provided the illusion of agency to people who had no real power to change their circumstances. The documentary evidence reveals that your story was simultaneously unique and completely typical. Every medieval city contained people who had followed similar paths: initial desperation, failed attempts at violence, gradual adaptation into other forms of survival, and eventual integration into the very systems they had once sought to escape through murder. What made medieval assassination truly unbearable wasn't the physical dangers or moral compromises, but the slow realization that the entire profession was a distraction from more fundamental problems that medieval society had no interest in solving. People suffered and died not because of individual moral failures, but because the world they inhabited was designed to produce suffering, desperation, and violence as natural consequences of its basic organizing principles. The final evidence for why it sucked to be a medieval assassin comes from the historical record itself. The profession eventually disappeared not because people became more moral or because society became less violent, but because better institutions gradually emerged that provided alternative solutions to the problems assassination had been supposed to address. Courts became more effective, economic opportunities expanded, and social mobility increased to the point where desperate people had options other than murder. Medieval assassination was a symptom of institutional failure, a profession that existed because the world was badly organized and poorly governed. It sucked to be a medieval assassin because it sucked to live in a medieval world, and assassination was just one of many brutal adaptations that people made to survive in circumstances that no human society should have tolerated. Your story ended peacefully because you lived long enough to see the beginning of changes that would eventually make your profession obsolete. The Renaissance that was dawning in Florence during your final years would bring new forms of art, literature, philosophy, and governance that provided better solutions to humanity's basic problems than murder ever could. That was the ultimate irony. Medieval assassination sucked because it was unnecessary, and everyone who lived through the period understood that it was unnecessary. But changing the conditions that made it seem necessary required transformations so fundamental that most people couldn't imagine them until they actually began to happen. The lesson of medieval assassination isn't about violence or morality. It's about the relationship between individual choices and social systems, and the way desperate circumstances can make terrible options seem reasonable until better alternatives become available. Your life was a bridge between a world that solved problems through violence and a world that would eventually solve them through better design. In the end, it sucked to be a medieval assassin because it was a job that shouldn't have needed to exist, performed by people who deserved better options, in service of systems that perpetuated the very problems they claimed to solve. The real tragedy wasn't that people died, but that they lived in a world designed to make killing seem like a viable career choice for anyone desperate enough to consider it. The documents that survived your death would puzzle historians for centuries, not because they contained shocking revelations about medieval assassination, but because they revealed how thoroughly ordinary your experience had been. Letters found in your possession showed correspondence with dozens of other former assassins, failed killers, and information brokers who had followed remarkably similar paths from desperation to accommodation to eventual integration into legitimate society. These letters painted a picture of an entire underground network of people who understood each other's compromises without judgment, who shared resources and opportunities without competition, who had collectively learned that survival required abandoning romantic notions about honor, justice, and moral purity in favor of pragmatic adaptation to systems that didn't care whether they lived or died. The most revealing correspondence was with a woman in Venice who had been hired to poison her own husband 20 years earlier, had failed due to last-minute conscience, and had subsequently built a thriving business helping other wives navigate impossible marriages through means that stopped just short of murder. Her letters showed the same pattern of initial desperation, moral compromise, and gradual success that characterized your own journey. Another exchange was with a former monk in Paris who had been commissioned to eliminate a rival claimant to his monastery's leadership, had discovered he couldn't go through with the killing, and had instead become an expert in the kind of bureaucratic manipulation that made assassination unnecessary. His detailed descriptions of church politics revealed how institutional violence was simply assassination by other means, slower but more thorough in its effects. The network these letters revealed was perhaps the most important aspect of why medieval assassination sucked. It created communities of people who were forever marked by experiences that separated them from normal society, but who had learned to find value and meaning in their shared understanding of how the world actually worked beneath its public pretenses. Your final letter, never sent but found among your papers after your death, was addressed to your younger self, the desperate man who had crouched in a Florence alley contemplating murder as a solution to problems that seemed insurmountable. In it, you tried to explain why assassination was the worst possible career choice, not because it was evil, but because it was a trap that promised quick solutions to problems that required patient, careful work to solve properly. The letter revealed your final understanding of why medieval assassination sucked. It offered the illusion of agency to people who had no real power, the fantasy of dramatic change to people trapped in circumstances that required gradual adaptation, the promise of individual solutions to problems that were fundamentally social in nature. It was seductive precisely because it was wrong, appealing because it was impossible, attractive because it avoided the hard work of actually understanding how the world functioned. Medieval assassination was ultimately a form of magical thinking, a belief that violence could transform complex systems through simple actions, that killing individual people could solve problems created by the interaction of thousands of people over centuries of accumulated injustice and institutional failure. It sucked because it didn't work, couldn't work, and would never work, but it took years of lived experience to understand why. Your final years were spent watching Florence transform itself into something that more closely resembled the world you had always wished existed. Trade became more regulated, courts became more reliable, economic opportunities expanded for people of modest background, and social mobility increased to the point where desperate people had alternatives to violence for improving their circumstances. The Renaissance that bloomed around you during your old age wasn't just about art and literature. It was about better governance, more sophisticated economic systems, and institutional innovations that addressed root causes of social problems rather than just their symptoms. The world was slowly learning to solve problems that medieval assassination had been trying to address through crude, ineffective means. You died understanding that you had lived through the end of an era, the final generation of people for whom assassination seemed like a rational career choice. Your children and grandchildren would inhabit a world where desperate people had better options, where social problems had institutional solutions, where violence was less necessary because civilization had finally begun to live up to its promises. The ultimate lesson of why it sucked to be a medieval assassin was revealed in that transition. The profession existed because the world was broken, and it would disappear when the world got fixed. Your life had been spent serving systems that deserved to be replaced, and your death coincided with the emergence of systems that might actually deserve to be served. In the end, medieval assassination sucked because it was a job for a world that was ending, performed by people who deserved to live in the world that was beginning. The tragedy wasn't that people became assassins, it was that they had to become assassins, when what they really needed was to become citizens of a society that valued human life enough to organize itself around human flourishing rather than human exploitation. Your story ended where it began, with someone crouched in shadows contemplating violence as a solution to impossible problems. But now you understood why those problems were impossible, why violence couldn't solve them, and why the real work of making the world better required patience, wisdom, and the kind of slow, careful effort that produced results too gradual to make good stories but too important to be left to chance. That was why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. Not because it was hard, but because it was pointless. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was unnecessary. Not because it was evil, but because it was a waste of human potential in service of systems that had already proven themselves unworthy of the sacrifices they demanded from people who deserved so much better than the world had given them. The final irony was that understanding this completely had taken a lifetime, and the understanding itself was the only thing that made that lifetime worthwhile. The centuries that followed would vindicate everything you learned about why medieval assassination was such a miserable profession, but in ways that you could never have anticipated while living through the experience. Historical scholars studying the transition from medieval to Renaissance society would identify people like you as crucial figures in understanding how civilizations actually change, not through dramatic events or heroic individuals, but through the accumulated experience of ordinary people who learned to navigate impossible circumstances with whatever tools they could find. Your letters and documents, preserved initially by accident rather than design, would eventually be recognized as some of the most valuable primary sources for understanding how medieval society actually functioned at ground level. Academic historians had spent centuries studying kings, wars, and major political movements, but they had very little insight into how desperate people made day-to-day survival decisions when all their options were terrible. The network of former assassins whose correspondence filled your final papers would be identified by modern scholars as an early example of what would later be called civil society, people organizing themselves to solve problems that official institutions couldn't or wouldn't address. Your informal community of failed killers, information brokers, and pragmatic survivors had developed systems of mutual support that were more effective than anything medieval government provided for people in your circumstances. Modern economic historians studying medieval Florence would use your financial records as case studies in how underground economies actually operated. Your transformation from failed assassin to successful information broker illustrated principles about market adaptation, risk management, and economic mobility that wouldn't be formally theorized until centuries later. You had been conducting sophisticated business operations while thinking you were just trying to survive another day. The most striking vindication of your experience would come from comparative studies of other societies that had faced similar challenges. Researchers would discover that every civilization going through rapid change produced people very much like you, individuals whose desperate circumstances forced them to develop skills and perspectives that turned out to be exactly what their societies needed to navigate transitions that nobody fully understood while they were happening. Your story wasn't unique to medieval Europe. Similar patterns appeared in ancient Rome during its decline, in China during dynastic transitions, in every society that had organized itself around systems that couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. The profession of assassination existed wherever civilizations had created problems they couldn't solve through legitimate means, and it disappeared wherever they learned to build institutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The final lesson that modern historians would draw from your experience was perhaps the most important. Medieval assassination sucked because medieval society sucked, but people like you had played crucial roles in creating the conditions that would eventually allow better societies to emerge. Your compromises, adaptations, and hard-won wisdom had contributed to the slow accumulation of social knowledge that made Renaissance humanism possible. You died thinking you had wasted your life serving systems that didn't deserve to exist, but history would judge you as someone who had helped create systems that did deserve to exist. The skills you developed as a failed assassin, observation, analysis of human motivation, understanding of how power actually worked, had been exactly the skills medieval society needed to evolve into something more humane. The ultimate irony was that the profession you thought had ruined your life had actually prepared you for work that helped repair the world that had created the need for assassins in the first place. Your legacy wasn't the violence you had contemplated, but the understanding you had developed about why violence was unnecessary when people learned to organize themselves more intelligently. In the end, it sucked to be a medieval assassin because it was a job for people who were smart enough to see what was wrong with the world but not powerful enough to fix it through conventional means. The real tragedy wasn't that such people existed, but that they had to figure everything out for themselves while the people who had power to make systematic changes were too invested in maintaining systems that didn't work. But the real vindication of your experience was that your children and grandchildren lived in a world where assassination was no longer a viable career option, not because people had become more moral, but because society had become more rational. The renaissance that emerged from medieval chaos hadn't been created by kings or philosophers. It had been built by thousands of people like you who had learned through bitter experience how to make impossible circumstances slightly more bearable, one small compromise at a time. That was the final answer to why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. It was a terrible job in a terrible world, performed by people who deserved much better but who somehow managed to use their terrible experiences to create the foundations for worlds that would eventually be worthy of human habitation. Your life had sucked, but it had mattered. Your choices had been awful, but they had contributed to changes that made awful choices less necessary for future generations. The darkness of medieval existence was real, but it wasn't permanent. The light that eventually emerged had been kindled by people who had learned to find meaning in meaningless circumstances, purpose in purposeless suffering, and hope in seemingly hopeless situations. You had been one of them, and that was enough, more than enough, to justify everything you had endured to get there. Medieval assassination sucked because medieval life sucked, but people like you had spent your lives learning how to make it suck less, and eventually, that had been enough to make all the difference. You set down the last scrap of parchment and feel an unexpected quiet settle over you. The way fresh snow muffles the world until even your heartbeat sounds louder than the wind. The centuries of voices you've just followed, murderers who became merchants, poisoners who turned into planners, outcasts who ended up architects of something better, fade like wood smoke threaded through moonlight. Then a thought slips in, sharp as a midnight bell. None of them ever knew you would be listening. What secrets might still be hiding in the silence, waiting for someone else to lean close? The lamplight pools across your desk like warm honey, thick and golden, and each sheet of vellum gleams the way river water flashes when a cloud slides from the sun. You notice how the ink blots resemble tiny constellations, a private night sky charting the distances between fear and hope. Somewhere inside that map, the failed assassin who once crouched on Florentine stones is still moving, still choosing, still teaching you how a broken road can curve unexpectedly toward daylight. Underneath the hush, you hear the creak of the timber floor. Was it only the house settling, or the past shifting its weight again? A restless curiosity lights up your chest like a hearth. After all those hard-won lessons, could you have done any better in his boots? That's the twist that stings, because while you'd like to believe yes, the letters whisper maybe not. They remind you that desperation has a flavor strong as raw garlic, burning the tongue so fiercely it drowns out every moral spice. And suddenly you taste it too. Somewhere in the walls, an old clock ticks twice, pauses, and refuses a third beat. Outside, the night wraps the city in charcoal velvet, each rooftop just a darker blade against the star-salted sky. The wind sighs across the shingles like a librarian shushing quarrelsome ghosts, and the air smells of distant rain mingling with chimney soot. You picture that aroma sliding down narrow medieval lanes, curling around market stalls, seeping through cracked shutters to mix with candle smoke and unwashed wool. Memory drifts the way mist clings to riverbanks at dawn, reluctant to rise even when the sun is lifting the horizon like a theater curtain. A floorboard groans again, closer this time, so you hold your breath, ears straining for a footstep that never comes. You realize, with a start that punches like cold water over the scalp, the biggest surprise of all. His story didn't end in that bed where fever finally took him. It coils through you, through every archive reader, every apprentice historian, every insomniac wandering the internet at 2 a.m. looking for something wild yet comforting. The assassin's long echo turns out to be a rescue rope, knotted from warnings and second chances, tossed across centuries so you won't mistake sudden violence for real power. A moth thumps against the window pane, wings tapping glass in frantic code, then slips away into darkness before you can decipher a single syllable. The pages rustle under your fingertips, soft as dried leaves caught in a secret breeze, and you understand why he kept writing even when his hand shook with age. Words are quieter than daggers, but they cut deeper and heal cleaner. Each confession became a seed. Each seed found soil in minds unborn. And from that soil grew safeguards, appeals courts, city charters, merchant contracts that don't demand blood for breach. You blink, and for a heartbeat the lamplight seems to flicker between centuries, turning parchment into cobblestones, ink into pooled rain, your steady desk into that alley where a hungry stranger once waited for courage to override conscience. Then the flame steadies, and you're alone again, aren't you? The last line he ever scratched down trembles under your gaze. If they listen hard enough, they'll hear we built tomorrow by refusing one more swing of the blade. Your pulse answers like a soft drum in an empty hall. You realize you've reached the story's edge, the place where the chronicles stop yet the consequences keep walking. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls midnight, its echo stretching like a bridge from past to present, inviting you to cross or daring you to turn back. Which will it be? A yawn steals up, warm and slow, and you sink into it the way a ship settles into harbor after storms. Ropes creak, sails fall slack, lanterns glow welcoming gold along the quay. As eyelids float lower, you feel the assassin's lesson fold around you like a quilt stitched from shadow and sunrise. Desperate choices birth difficult wisdom. Difficult wisdom, shared, becomes safer worlds. The wind hushes, the clock finally grants its third tick, and the room exhales a promise older than any empire. Rest now. Tomorrow begins with what you learned tonight. You escaped, but only just. The blood's still on your hands. The guards will remember your face. And your next mission will be harder. Because in this line of work, survival isn't victory. It's just the beginning of the next job. If you made it through this, comment what you would have done differently, and subscribe to stay alive through the next contract.